All right, hello everybody. I have something for you today about cardinal utility and the problems of it. So, there was a recent article by David Gordon discussing the book What We Owe the Future by William McCaskill on utilitarian ethics, and it got me thinking about how crazy absurd cardinal utility theory is. Even from, a layman's perspective, the strangeness of cardinal utility seems like a good reason to maybe believe there's something seriously wrong with its premises, right? It leads to ideas like a dictator made so happy by enslaving others that happiness outweighs all the negatives of the people who are being enslaved, as well as other bizarre conclusions, including what are called the sadistic conclusion and the repugnant conclusion, which both involve optimizing utility in groups. I'll put links in the blog post version of this to articles that discuss those conclusions. However, academics persist at papering over these conclusions and justifying all kinds of really horrifying policies. This suggests some kind of perverse desire that I don't admit to fully understanding. I suppose the title Professor of Ethical Philosophy has a nicer ring than Professor of Genocide Planning, but aside from that, I don't see what the appeal is. To define our terms, cardinal utility states that the utilities of bundles of goods to people can be measured numerically in a unit that's got a bunch of different names, but very commonly it's called the util for utility. For example, you might look at 3 bananas and 1 apple and say, oh, that's 7 utils to person A. And that same person might look at 2 bananas and 2 apples and say, oh, that's 8 utils for person A. Another person might get different numbers for the same goods. The alternative to cardinal utility is called ordinal utility, which says that utility is a ranking, not a number. If we look at the previous example, the person in question prefers 2 bananas and 2 apples to 3 bananas and 1 apple, but there's no unit that you can measure that's shared between these goods or another person's valuations. So, even neoclassical economists admit in general that ordinal utility is the correct point of view. However, cardinal value and cardinal value scales have a attractiveness to them because it permits them to devise mathematical theories and models from which they can pretend to understand the economy and make predictions. However, there was an article by William Barnett II in which he talks about serious logical issues, mathematical issues, with how neoclassicals convert these ordinal scales to cardinal scales. But I think a simpler way to put it is that the real world does not exist for the convenience of neoclassical economists, and it shows. In fact, aside from these logical problems with converting these scales between each other, we observe even more issues with cardinal utility. First off, it's really arbitrary and unmeasurable. People claim that they can measure stuff, but you really can't. Here's why. Preferences are revealed by action, right? By actions. And Rothbard observes that people have made attempts to show preferences from inaction, but these inevitably lead to an absurd statement. Moreover, people's valuations vary over time, so a collection of exchange data from different times might not even describe the same value scale. Therefore, it's really not possible to measure or deduce numerical differences in utility after trade, even given a large data set, which, by the way, we usually don't have those large data sets. So, in fact, the creation of numerical value scales by theorists is often a tool to hide or avoid considering certain goods or certain perceptions. In a classic example, the cardinal utilitarian argues that taking $100 from a millionaire and giving it to a poor person increases net utility, since the poor person values that $100 more than the millionaire does. The usual justification is a corruption of diminishing returns. The millionaire has many dollars. Therefore, that top $100 is worth very little to him compared to the poor person. However, this comparison focuses only on these two people and ignores others. For instance, the $100 might be invested by the millionaire and might provide long-term utility to a business that serves a large number of customers, as compared to immediate consumption. Even worse, there's complexities involved of, say, time preference, and those are often ignored. Even going a step further, the comparison here ignores the need for some agent to force this transfer to happen, to take the $100 from the millionaire and give it to the other guy. And the last thing that the cardinal theorist wants for you to consider is how much satisfaction the millionaire might gain from stopping a thief. Another problem with cardinal utility scales is that they effectively eliminate moral precepts. Cardinal utility people will tell you that this isn't so, but it kind of is. A cardinal theorist would argue that what you need to do is choose a larger negative number to represent the disutility of fraud or theft or violence, up to and including murder. You have to include all these things. But since these numbers are all arbitrary, that doesn't really solve the problem. Any determined statist will simply look at this and say, oh, I just need to imagine more positive aspects of the aggression. In these far extremes, we find other weird problems, right? For instance, okay, how do we describe the utility of a person who's no longer alive after they're already alive? Clearly, the dead person doesn't experience any psychological trauma anymore, which, says, well, the value should be 0. But how do we square that with the assumed large negative value of killing someone? It suggests that the negatives for murder are merely psychological effects on others, which leads to more awful conclusions that I'm sure you can imagine. But what about someone who is seriously depressed? Calculating numerical utilities leads to a number of perversities, one being the movement of Canada's healthcare system recently to not just allow, but to embrace and encourage doctor-assisted suicide for people with mental and other non-terminal illnesses. In reality, the only way to be sure that a transaction increases net utility is to show that it is voluntary. Everything else falls flat. In a voluntary transaction, both parties independently, through their own interpretations of their own value scales, including any psychological effects and time preferences, all that stuff gets factored in, as much as the people want to factor it in. And then they decide that the exchange makes them better off, and it makes them both better off because they have to agree. This makes me better off, and you have to agree that this makes you better off. There aren't any utils to measure, and there's no room for anyone to apply force. And since each party's value scale might shift between this exchange and the next, there really isn't any way to compare this exchange with others. The best that a third party could hope to do would be to provide information to trading parties and make sure that they're both fully aware of the consequences. But this doesn't provide any room for a coercive state to meddle in people's, interactions. And so, unfortunately, it seems likely that state-funded academics, especially state-funded academics, are going to try to continue to count the angels on the head of this pin for the foreseeable future. Our best bet, as people that love liberty, is to remind everyone, loudly and frequently, of how bankrupt their theories are. So, I have some citations here. I will put them in the blog post version on my website so that you can follow those links. And thanks for listening.